I did not come to your bed. I came to your destiny. The pen trembled between her fingers as shadows danced on the walls of the royal chamber. The Sultan watched her from his throne of dark velvet, with those eyes that had seen empires fall and kings beg. Sahara knew that what she was about to do could cost her her life, but in that instant, while silence crushed the air between them, she understood that some battles are not fought with swords, but with words. She wrote the last line on the parchment, stood up with her back straight and walked towards the most feared man in the kingdom. When she spoke, her voice did not tremble. I did not come to your bed. I came to your destiny. The Sultan's face hardened like carved stone. No one, absolutely no one in all of Almaguer had ever dared to challenge him in that way. His hands clenched tightly on the arms of the seat, and for a terrible moment, Sahara saw death reflected in his pupils. But she did not look away, she did not retreat. The parchment fell softly onto the table between them, and the written words shone under the candlelight like a silent challenge to absolute power. Before continuing with this story, I need to know something important. Tell me from which city and country you are watching us. It excites me to know that this story is reaching hearts in different corners of the world. Write it right now in the comments, and let's continue together with what happened that night. It had all begun 3 weeks earlier, when the sun was just breaking over the golden hills surrounding the Sagir village. Sahara woke up that day without knowing it would be the last sunrise of her life as a free woman. At 19 years old, she had learned to read the silent language of her home. The hallways being too quiet meant her father was plotting something. The evasive looks of the servants announced bad news, and the scent of sandalwood incense in the main hall revealed that there were important visitors. That morning, all 3 signs were present. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple ivory-colored linen dress that contrasted with her dark skin and her straight black hair, which fell in waves to the middle of her back. Sahara had inherited the green eyes of her Persian grandmother, a rarity that her father always mentioned as if it were just another jewel in his collection. She went down the stairs with measured steps, each one echoing on the cold stone floor. When she reached the hall, she found her father sitting in his favorite chair, the one with lion carvings on the arms. Next to him was the Sultan's vizier, a tall, thin man like a shadow, dressed in black robes embroidered with gold. Sahara, come closer, ordered her father without looking her in the eyes. That was the first sign that something terrible was about to happen. She obeyed, crossing the hall with her head held high. The vizier examined her from head to toe with a look that made her feel like cattle in a market. He nodded slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture that seemed to satisfy her father. My daughter, today is a glorious day for our family, began her father in an affected voice, as if reciting a rehearsed speech. Sultan Kale, may the heavens bless him, has decided to honor us with a marital alliance. You will be his wife. The world stopped. Sahara felt the floor beneath her feet turn into quicksand. She had heard stories about Sultan Kale since she was a child, stories that mothers used to scare their children when they misbehaved. The Sultan who had conquered 5 kingdoms before turning 30. The man who executed traitors in the public square without blinking. The warrior whose scars covered both his body and his soul. And now that man would be her husband. Father, She tried to speak, but he raised his hand to silence her. There is nothing to discuss. The decision is made. The Sultan has already sent the dowry. The ceremony will be in 10 days. The vizier stood up, adjusting his robes with precise movements. The young lady is suitable. The Sultan will be pleased. The preparations will begin tomorrow at dawn. And so, without asking her, without considering her wishes, without caring about her dreams, Sahara was sold like a fine carpet or a purebred horse. Her father didn't even have the decency to look remorseful. In his eyes, only ambition shone, the hunger for power that had consumed him for years. For him, his daughter was nothing more than a pawn on the chessboard of his social ascent. If this story is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like so we can reach more people. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations. Seamstresses arrived at all hours with fabrics and brocades. Jewelers presented necklaces of gold and precious stones. Masters of ceremony rehearsed the protocol over and over again, but no one, absolutely no one, asked Sahara how she felt. No one noticed the silent tears she shed every night in the solitude of her room. No one heard the muffled screams into her pillow. During those days of forced confinement, Sahara spent her hours in her father's library, the only place where she found solace. She read about ancient philosophy, mystical poetry, stories of wise women who had changed the course of history not with strength, but with intelligence. It was in those books that she found her weapon. If she was to be delivered as an object, at least she would arrive at the palace with something no one could take away from her, her mind. The kingdom of Almaguir was a jewel of the desert, a land of violent contrasts, where extreme luxury coexisted with absolute poverty. The Sultan's palace rose in the heart of the capital, like a mountain of white marble and golden towers that shone under the relentless sun. From there, Sultan Kale ruled with an iron fist. He was not a tyrant for pleasure, but by conviction. He had learned from childhood that mercy was weakness, and that power was maintained only through fear. His advisers flattered him, his generals obeyed him without question, and his people respected him out of fear more than love. Kale had ascended to the throne at 16 after his father died in battle against invaders from the north. Since then, he had not known a single day of peace. Wars, conspiracies, betrayals, assassination attempts. Each experience had hardened his heart a little more until it became something that could barely be called human. At 32, he had already buried 2 previous wives, both dead, while giving birth to children who also did not survive. Some said the Sultan was cursed, others that he simply did not know how to love because his heart had turned to stone long ago. This third marriage was not for love or desire, it was a political move. The Sajir family controlled important trade routes in the eastern part of the kingdom, and allying with them meant securing the flow of spices and silks that kept the royal coffers full. The Sultan had seen a portrait of Sahara and had nodded indifferently. Young, beautiful, from a good family, she would serve dynastic purposes, nothing more. The wedding day arrived like a sentence. Sahara was awakened before dawn and immersed in a bath of milk and rose petals. Unknown hands dressed her in a white wedding dress embroidered with silver threads that weighed as much as her anguish. They painted her eyes with kohl and her lips with dark carmine. They hung jewels on her neck, wrists, and ankles. When she looked in the mirror, she did not recognize herself. The young woman staring back from the glass seemed like an expensive doll, beautiful and empty. The journey to the palace was endless. Sahara traveled in a closed litter, surrounded by guards and maids who did not speak to her. Through the silk curtains she could see fragments of the outside world, bustling markets, children playing in the streets, women carrying water jars on their heads. Normal life, a life she would never know again. When they arrived at the palace, the silence was deafening. There was no music, no flowers, no celebration. The ceremony took place in the throne room, a space as vast and cold as a marble tomb. The Sultan stood waiting next to the religious judge, dressed in dark purple war robes. Sahara walked down the endless aisle, each step echoing like a funeral beat. When she finally stood before him, she dared to look up. The first thing she noticed were the scars. They crossed his face like maps of past battles, but they didn't make him ugly, just incredibly intimidating. His eyes were black like obsidian and just as cold. He did not smile, did not greet her, didn't even seem to really see her. To him, she was invisible, just another cog in the machinery of his kingdom. The judge began to recite the ceremonial words in a monotone voice. Sahara listened without hearing, her mind floating far from that place. When the time came to give her consent, her voice came out as barely a whisper. "I accept." The Sultan didn't even repeat the words. He simply nodded. With that, they were united. Husband and wife, master and property. The ceremony ended in less than an hour. There was no banquet, no congratulations, no kisses or hugs. The Sultan immediately withdrew to attend to matters of state, leaving Sahara in the hands of the palace maids. They led her through labyrinthine hallways, decorated with tapestries that told stories of conquests and victories. Finally, they reached the royal quarters, a suite of rooms so luxurious they were oppressive. "The Sultan will come tonight," the headmaid, an older woman with a severe face, informed her. "Prepare yourself appropriately." And they left her alone. Sahara stood in the center of the room, surrounded by silks and pillows, golden lamps and porcelain vases. Everything was beautiful, and everything was a prison. She walked to the balcony and looked towards the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky orange and red. She thought about jumping. It would be so easy. One step, the void, the end. But something inside her rebelled against that idea. She hadn't survived 19 years. She hadn't read all those books, hadn't learned everything she knew, just to give up without a fight. If she was to be here, if there was no escape, then she would do something no one expected. She would not be the submissive wife everyone imagined. She would be something more dangerous. She would be herself. The hours passed slowly. Sahara took off the jewels one by one and left them on the table. She changed out of her wedding dress into something simpler, a white linen tunic she found in the closet. She let her hair down and let it fall freely over her shoulders. She searched through the furniture until she found what she needed: parchment, a pen, and ink. She sat at the desk and began to write. The words flowed from her mind to the page, like a contained river, finally finding an outlet. She wrote about true power, about the difference between being feared and being respected, about the loneliness of kings and the strength of the wise. She wrote the poem that had been forming in her heart since the day she found out she would be given to this man. When she finished, she read the words quietly. They were perfect. They were her declaration of silent war. The door opened without warning. The Sultan entered the room with heavy steps, accompanied by the scent of leather and steel. He closed the door behind him and looked at her with that same indifferent gaze from the ceremony. "So this is my new wife," he said in a deep voice, walking towards her like a predator assessing its prey. Zahara did not retreat. She made a formal bow, but did not lower her eyes. The Sultan raised an eyebrow, surprised by this small act of defiance. "Do you know why you are here?" he asked, stopping a few steps away. "To serve my father's interests and strengthen his position at court," she replied in a clear voice. The Sultan let out a short, harsh laugh. "At least you're honest. That's more than I can say for most." He moved closer, and Sahara could see the marks of time and war on his face. Beneath the hardness, beneath the scars, there was something else, something that seemed like infinite weariness. "Do you know what is expected of you tonight?" he said. And it wasn't a question. Sahara took a deep breath. This was the moment, the instant that would define everything that came after. "I know what everyone expects," she replied, "but I did not come here to fulfill expectations." She walked to the table and placed the parchment on it. Then she turned to the Sultan and looked him directly in the eyes. "I did not come to your bed. I came to your destiny." The silence that followed was absolute. The Sultan looked at her as if he had never seen a woman before. His eyes narrowed, assessing, measuring. His hand moved towards the hilt of the dagger he carried at his belt. Sahara saw the movement, but did not flinch. "Do you know what you are saying, girl?" he asked in a dangerously soft voice. "You are mine by decree, by law, by right of conquest." "By decree, yes," Sahara replied, and her voice did not tremble. "But by choice, not yet." The Sultan advanced until he was standing right in front of her. He was much taller, stronger, more powerful in every way. He could break her like a dry branch if he wanted, but Sahara stood firm with her chin raised and a serene gaze. "Read it," she said, pointing to the parchment. For a moment that seemed eternal. The Sultan did not move. Then with a brusque movement he took the paper and read the written words. His expression did not change, but something stirred in his eyes. "A king can conquer 1,000 lands, but he will only be great if he conquers one soul." He dropped the parchment onto the table. He looked at Sahara once more, and in that gaze there was something new. It wasn't respect yet, but perhaps it was the beginning of curiosity. "I will give you this night to reconsider your audacity," he said finally. "Tomorrow we will speak again, and then you will decide if your intelligence is stronger than your survival instinct." He headed for the door, but before leaving he stopped without turning around. "No one in all my years as Sultan has ever spoken to me like that. I don't know if you are brave or just stupid, but you have achieved something I thought impossible. You have captured my attention." The door closed behind him with a definitive sound. Sahara collapsed onto the bed, trembling for the first time since it all began. The tears came then, silent and liberating. She had played the riskiest card of her life. Now all that was left was to wait and see if she would survive to play the next one. That night, while the palace slept and the stars shone over Almaguer, Sahara remained awake, looking at the ceiling decorated with painted constellations. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. She had challenged the most powerful man in the kingdom, and strangely, instead of feeling fear, she felt something akin to hope, because for the first time in her life, she had chosen her own destiny. And although she did not know what dawn would bring, she knew she had planted a small seed of doubt in the heart of a tyrant. And in time, if she nurtured it well, that seed could grow into something no one expected, into something that could change not only her life, but the destiny of an entire kingdom. The first rays of sun came through the carved wooden lattice when Sahara woke up. She had slept barely 2 hours, but her mind was clearer than ever. She got out of bed and walked to the balcony, watching the kingdom awaken. From that height, Almaguer looked like a living map. The narrow market streets, the houses stacked on top of each other like ivory boxes, and beyond, the walls that protected the city from external enemies. But no wall protected the people from their own ruler. For 5 days, the Sultan did not summon her. Sahara remained in her quarters, attended by silent maids who came and went like shadows. They brought her food that she barely tasted, dresses she did not ask for, jewels she did not want. No one spoke to her directly. It was as if she lived in a golden cage where even the air was measured. In those days of forced solitude, Sahara explored every corner of her rooms, looking for books, parchments, anything that would give her information about the man to whom she was now bound. She found a small library hidden behind a side door. The shelves were covered in dust, a sign that no one had touched them in years. There were military treatises, maps of conquered territories, records of battles won. Everything spoke of war and power. Nothing spoke of wisdom or compassion. Sahara spent hours reading these documents, learning about the Sultan's campaigns, his strategies, the decisions he had made. And on every page, she saw the same pattern: conquer, dominate, control, never build, never heal, never unite. On the morning of the 6th day, a maid entered with a different look in her eyes. "The Sultan requires your presence in the private audience hall. Now." Sahara felt her heart accelerate, but she did not let her face show it. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple tunic of dark blue that enhanced the green of her eyes. She wore no jewels, no makeup on her face. If the Sultan wanted to see her, he would see her as she was, without adornments or masks. The private audience hall was smaller than the throne room, but just as imposing. The walls were decorated with ancient weapons, swords, spears, shields that told the military history of the dynasty. The Sultan was sitting in a high-backed chair, dressed in blood-colored robes. When Sahara entered, he looked up from the documents he was reviewing, and looked at her with the same intensity as their first encounter. "Come closer," he ordered in a neutral voice. Sahara walked until she stood before him, maintaining the appropriate distance. She bowed, but did not lower her head completely. The Sultan noticed that small gesture of dignity, and something resembling amusement shone in his eyes. "I have been thinking about your words," he said, setting the documents aside. "That phrase you wrote, that ridiculous poem about conquering souls." "It wasn't ridiculous," Sahara replied calmly. "It was the truth." The Sultan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "The truth. And what do you know about governing a kingdom? What do you know about the decisions a sultan must make every day, about the enemies lurking around every corner, about the betrayals waiting in every shadow? I know that a king who rules only with fear will eventually be left alone with his fear," she replied. "The subjects obey because they have no choice, not because they believe in you. And a kingdom built on terror is a kingdom built on sand. Sooner or later, it collapses." The Sultan's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Be careful with your words, girl. You are my wife, not my advisor." "Then why did you summon me?" asked Sahara, and for the first time she allowed a touch of defiance to tinge her voice. "If you only wanted obedience, there are 1,000 women in this kingdom who would give it to you without question. But you chose me, and now I am here in front of you, telling you things no one else dares to say." The silence stretched between them like an abyss. The Sultan stood up abruptly and began to pace from one side of the hall to the other, his steps echoing against the marble. Zahara watched him, studying every movement, every gesture. There was tension in his shoulders, conflict in his gaze. He was fighting something within himself. "My father taught me that mercy is for the weak," he said finally, stopping in front of a window. "That a king must be feared before he is loved, that power is maintained with the sword, not with pretty words." "And look where that teaching has led you," Sahara replied softly. "You have a vast kingdom, incalculable wealth, armies that obey you. But when you close your eyes at night, can you sleep in peace, or do you spend every moment waiting for the dagger that will come for your back?" The Sultan turned sharply towards her, and for an instant Sahara saw something in his eyes that surprised her. Vulnerability. It disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but she had seen it. "And what do you propose?" he asked in a rough voice. "That I be soft, that I forgive my enemies, that I give flowers and songs to those who want me dead?" "I propose that you see the difference between strength and cruelty," said Sahara, taking a step forward. "Between justice and vengeance, between being a conqueror and being a leader. Your armies can take cities, but only your wisdom can win hearts." The Sultan looked at her for a long time, as if trying to decipher an impossible riddle. "Tell me about my kingdom, then," he said finally, sitting back down. "Since you think you know so much, tell me what you see from your little princess balcony." Sahara took a deep breath. This was her opportunity, perhaps the only one she would have. "I see the women who go out before dawn to fetch water, because the public fountains have dried up and no one has repaired them. I see the merchants who pay taxes so high they can barely feed their families. I see the soldiers who return from war with wounds that no one heals, because there aren't enough doctors in the poor neighborhoods. I see the children playing in dirty streets because no one cleans the waste. And I see a palace that shines with gold, while the people who support it are crumbling." The Sultan's jaw tightened. "I keep this kingdom safe. That's what matters. Safe from external enemies." "Yes," Sahara conceded. "But what about the internal enemies? Hunger, disease, despair?" "Those also kill, only more slowly. And when the people are desperate, when they have nothing to lose, they become dangerous. You don't need to build higher walls. You need to build a kingdom where people want to live, not just survive." The Sultan stood up again and walked towards her. Sahara prepared for fury, for punishment, but he simply looked at her with an expression she could not decipher. "You irritate me deeply," he said, "but you also intrigue me. And that is something that hasn't happened to me in years." Over the following days, the Sultan began to summon Sahara more frequently. At first, they were brief conversations, almost confrontations where he defended his methods, and she questioned them with arguments he could not easily refute. Gradually, the conversations became longer, deeper. Sahara spoke to him about philosophy, history, about the great leaders of the past who had built empires not only with swords, but with wisdom. "A strong kingdom is born not from fear, but from respect," she told him one afternoon, as they walked through the palace's private gardens. "When people respect you, they will follow you even in the most difficult times. When they only fear you, they will abandon you as soon as they see an opportunity." The Sultan plucked a rose from a bush and looked at it thoughtfully. "Respect is earned, fear is imposed. One is slow, the other is immediate." "But fear is fragile," Sahara replied. "It breaks at the first sign of weakness. Respect, on the other hand, endures. It is passed down from generation to generation. Your father ruled with fear, and look what he left you, a kingdom full of resentment and conspiracies. Do you want to leave the same for your heir?" Those words touched something deep within the Sultan. That night, he could not sleep. Sahara's phrases resonated in his mind like bells that would not stop ringing. He got up before dawn and made a decision that would change everything. He dressed in simple merchant's clothes, covered his face with a turban, and left the palace without guards, without an escort, without telling anyone, except for his personal guard, who would follow at a distance. Kale wanted to see his kingdom with his own eyes, not through the flattering reports of his advisors. What he found shook him to the bone. He walked through the central market and saw entire families fighting over scraps of food. He heard merchants complaining about impossible taxes that were driving them to ruin. He saw children with bellies swollen from hunger and eyes empty of hope. He witnessed the city guards beating an old man for not paying a fine he clearly could not afford, and most painfully, he heard the people speak of him with a mixture of fear and hatred. "The Sultan only sees us when he needs soldiers for his wars," said a woman in the market while buying stale bread. "To him, we are not people. We are resources." "My son died in the last campaign," added another. "We didn't even receive his body to bury. Just a letter saying he had fallen with honor. What honor is there in dying far from home for a war we don't understand?" The Sultan returned to the palace when the sun was high, his heart heavier than it had been in years. He went straight to Sahara's quarters without changing his clothes. When she saw him enter, covered in dust and with his face uncovered, she knew immediately that something had changed. "You were right," he said in a hoarse voice. "I have been blind. I have been so busy conquering lands that I forgot to care for the people who inhabit them." Sahara approached him and for the first time touched his arm in a gesture of comfort. "It is not too late to change." "How?" he asked, and there was genuine desperation in his voice. "How do I undo years of mistakes? How do I regain the trust of a people who hate me?" "Step by step," she replied, "action by action. Start by repairing the public fountains, reduce taxes for small merchants, establish hospitals in the poor neighborhoods, listen to the people's complaints and address them. Show them that you are not just a conqueror, but also a protector." The Sultan looked at her with an intensity that made her tremble, but not from fear. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "Why are you helping me? I am the one who tore you from your previous life, who made you my property." "Because I saw something in you that perhaps you yourself do not see," replied Sahara. "I saw a man capable of more than just destruction. And because if I am to be here, if this is to be my kingdom, I also want it to be a place worth living in." That conversation marked a turning point. The Sultan began to implement changes, small at first but significant. He ordered the repair of public fountains, reduced taxes by 20%. He established free medical clinics in 3 poor neighborhoods, and most importantly, he began to listen. He established public audiences where any citizen could present their complaints directly to him. At first, people came with fear, expecting traps or punishments. But when they saw that the Sultan was really listening, that he took notes, that he asked questions, they began to believe that perhaps something was changing. Sahara attended these audiences, sitting discreetly to one side. She did not speak, but her presence did not go unnoticed. The women of the town began to see her not as the Sultan's decorative wife, but as something more. Rumors spread that she was behind the changes, that the Sultan consulted her, that he listened to her. And although some viewed it with distrust, others began to call her in whispers, "the woman who tamed the lion." The changes did not go unnoticed in the palace. The Sultan's advisors, men who had served his father and who benefited from the established corrupt system, began to grow restless. They met in secret, whispered in the hallways, exchanged looks laden with meaning. The most powerful among them was Rashid, the Grand Vizier, a man of 60 with a grey beard and eyes as cunning as a snake's. One night, after the Sultan announced he would reduce taxes on trade caravans, something that would directly affect the commissions the advisors received, Rashid convened a secret meeting in his quarters. 7 advisors attended, all with the same concerns. "The Sultan has lost his way," said Rashid, pouring wine into silver cups. "He has changed since that girl arrived at the palace. He has weakened." "She has bewitched him," added another advisor, a fat man named Malik. "What other explanation is there?" A warrior feared in 5 kingdoms now worries about water fountains and hospitals. It is unnatural. It is witchcraft, agreed a third. I have heard he spends entire nights writing poems. Poems? Since when does a sultan write poetry? Rashid struck the table with his cup, silencing the murmur. Whether it is witchcraft or simple manipulation, the result is the same. The sultan is becoming soft, and a soft leader is dangerous for all of us. If this continues, we will lose not only our wealth but also our power. The people will begin to demand more changes. They will want a voice in government. They will want justice. And then, where will we be? What do you propose? Asked Malik, wiping sweat from his forehead. Rashid smiled, and it was a smile that did not reach his eyes. I propose we eliminate the root of the problem. If the girl disappears, the Sultan will return to who he was. He has done it before. He has buried 2 wives. He can bury a 3rd. The advisors looked at each other, some with horror, others with barely concealed greed. Are you speaking of murder? Asked one of the younger ones in a trembling voice. That is treason. No, corrected Rashid. I am speaking of saving the kingdom, and it will not be murder, it will be justice. We will accuse her of witchcraft. We have witnesses we can buy. Maids who will say they have seen her performing strange rituals. Guards who will swear they heard chants in unknown tongues. The evidence will pile up until it is impossible to ignore. And if the Sultan refuses to believe it? Asked another. He will not be able to refuse, Rashid replied confidently. The law is clear. If there are enough testimonies of witchcraft, the accused must be tried, and in a trial we control the rules, the witnesses, the sentence. Everything. If this is outraging you, if you feel the rage of seeing how they plan to destroy Sahara after all she has fought for, I need you to show me. Leave your like right now and tell me in the comments if you think she will survive this conspiracy. Your support helps me continue to bring you stories that touch your heart. The advisors withdrew that night with a plan drawn up. Over the following days, they began to spread rumors, first subtle, then more direct. They paid maids to lie, guards to give false testimony, merchants to talk about strange signs around the young wife of the Sultan. The poison of the lie infiltrated the palace like invisible smoke. Sahara, unaware of the conspiracy, continued her routine. Her conversations with the Sultan had become more frequent, more intimate, not in a physical sense, but in something deeper. They shared thoughts, fears, dreams. He spoke to her of his childhood, of the scars he carried not only on his body but on his soul. She spoke to him of her readings, of the philosophies she had studied, of her vision of what a kingdom could be. One afternoon, as they walked in the gardens, the Sultan stopped in front of a pond full of golden fish. I had never noticed how much beauty there is in this place, he said. I was always so busy planning the next battle that I never stopped to look at what I already had. Sahara knelt by the pond and put her hand in the water, watching as the fish curiously approached. The beauty was always here. You just needed eyes to see it. The Sultan knelt beside her, so close that their shoulders touched. You gave me those eyes, he said quietly. I don't know whether to call it a curse or a blessing. Why would it be a curse? She asked, turning to look at him. Because now I see everything I have done wrong, all the people I have hurt, all the opportunities I wasted, and that knowledge weighs like 1,000 chains. Sahara placed her hand on his, a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. Knowledge weighs, yes, but it also liberates, because only when you know something is broken can you begin to repair it. In that moment, sharing the silence by the pond, surrounded by flowers that perfumed the air and fish that danced under the crystalline water, something changed between them. It was not love yet. It was something more fragile and more profound at the same time. It was the beginning of a connection that neither of them had expected to find. But while they were discovering this nascent bond, the shadows were closing in around them. The advisors had gathered enough false evidence. The testimonies were ready, the trap was set. And soon, very soon, Sahara would face the greatest danger of her life. That night, when she returned to her quarters, she found something that made her stop short. On her pillow was a black rose, a symbol of death in the kingdom of Almaguir. There was no note, no explanation, just that dark flower like a promise of destruction. Sahara took it between her fingers, feeling the thorns digging into her skin. A drop of blood fell onto the black petal. She looked towards the closed door, towards the latticed windows, towards the shadows dancing in the corners of the room. Someone wanted her dead, and that someone was inside the palace. Dawn arrived with shouts and banging on the door. Sahara had barely slept after finding the black rose, her senses alert to every sound, every shadow. When the guards burst into her quarters with torches lit, she knew the silent threat had materialized. "By order of Grand Vizier Rashid, you are under arrest on charges of witchcraft and conspiracy against the kingdom," announced the captain of the guard, a burly man with a reddish beard who avoided looking her in the eyes. Sahara stood up slowly, not showing the terror that threatened to paralyze her. The maids who slept in the adjoining rooms ran to her with tears in their eyes, but the guards pushed them away roughly. "There is a mistake," said Sahara in a firm voice. "I am the Sultan's wife. You cannot arrest me without his consent." "The Sultan has been informed," replied the captain, and something in his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced of what he was doing. "The evidence against you is compelling. Witnesses have declared the law must be obeyed." They took her through the palace hallways with her wrists bound. It was early, just dawn, but the rumors had already spread like fire in dry grass. Servants peeked through half-open doors, whispering among themselves. Some looked at her with pity, others with barely concealed satisfaction. Sahara kept her head high, refusing to give them the spectacle of seeing her break down. They led her to the palace dungeons, a place she had never seen but had heard terrible stories about. The cells were dug into the living rock, damp and cold like tombs. They locked her in one of the cells at the back, where the sunlight barely reached through a narrow slit high in the wall. The iron door closed with a definitive sound that resonated in her bones. Sahara sat on the stone floor and hugged her knees. For the first time since it all began, she allowed a single tear to roll down her cheek, just one. Then she breathed deeply and forced herself to think clearly. Someone had accused her, someone powerful, and that someone had gathered witnesses willing to lie. The question was, why? And the answer came with painful clarity, because she was changing the Sultan, and that change threatened the power of those who benefited from the corrupt system. The hours passed with torturous slowness. No one came to see her. No one brought her water or food. The silence of the dungeon was absolute, broken only by the constant dripping of water seeping between the stones. Sahara closed her eyes and forced herself to remember everything she had read about false accusations, about manipulated trials, about how the powerful used the law as a weapon. In the palace, the Sultan had been awakened by Rashid at dawn. The Grand Vizier entered his quarters with a grave face and a folder full of documents. "My lord, I regret interrupting your rest, but there is an urgent matter that requires your immediate attention," said Rashid in a solemn tone. Kale sat up in bed, still groggy from sleep. "What is so urgent that it cannot wait?" "Your wife, my lord, Sahara. Very serious accusations have arisen against her." The Sultan stood up immediately, completely awake. "What kind of accusations?" Rashid opened the folder and began to read in a monotone voice. "Witchcraft, my lord. 7 maids have testified that they have seen her performing strange rituals in her quarters at night. 4 guards have sworn to hearing chants in unknown tongues. And there is more. A spice merchant claims she bought ingredients commonly used in domination spells. Everything points to her using dark arts to manipulate your will." Kyle felt as if he had been doused with ice water. "That is absurd. Sahara is not a witch. She is just an educated woman." "My lord," said Rashid with false concern, "I understand this is difficult to accept, but the changes in your behavior since her arrival are undeniable. A warrior feared in 5 kingdoms now worries about water fountains and poems. Don't you find that strange? Don't you think something unnatural is happening?" The Sultan walked to the window, his mind spinning violently. One part of him, the part trained by his father to distrust everything and everyone, wondered if it could be true. Sahara had arrived, and everything had changed. But another part, the part that had begun to awaken thanks to her, knew this was a trap. "I want to see her," he said finally. "My lord, the law is clear," Rashid replied quickly. "When there are formal accusations of witchcraft with multiple witnesses, the accused must be isolated until the trial. It is for your own safety. If she really is a witch, she might try to bewitch you again." "I am the Sultan," roared Kale. "I decide what is safe for me. And as Sultan, you must respect the laws you yourself have sworn to defend," Rashid pressed. "If you make an exception now, you will show weakness. The enemies of the kingdom will see that the Sultan can be manipulated by a pretty woman. Your authority will erode." Kyle clenched his fists until his knuckles turned white. Rashid had touched the right chord. All his life he had been taught that showing favoritism or emotion was weakness, that a king could not afford to act with his heart. "When will the trial be?" he asked in a tense voice. "In 3 days, my lord." "Time enough for all witnesses to be gathered and all evidence presented." "So be it then," said Kale, hating himself with every word. "But I want everything done according to the law, a fair trial with the right to defense." "Of course, my lord," Rashid replied with a bow, and as he turned, a smile of triumph briefly crossed his face. In the cell, Sahara found a rusty nail in a crack in the wall. She used it to scratch words into the damp stone, not poems this time, but clear thoughts, evidence of her sanity for anyone who came after. She wrote about the injustice of false accusations, about how power corrupts those who have it, about the importance of truth even when the whole world lies. The first day in the cell passed without visitors. On the second day, a young guard brought her water and a piece of hard bread. When the door opened, Sahara saw something in the boy's eyes. Doubt. "Do you believe I am a witch?" she asked him directly. The guard hesitated, looking down the hallway to make sure no one was listening. "I don't know, my lady, but my mother was sick 2 weeks ago, a fever that wouldn't break. The doctors in the neighborhood couldn't do anything. Then they opened the new clinic that the Sultan ordered, built after you arrived. The doctors there cured her without charging a single coin. My mother says that was the work of an angel, not a witch." Sahara felt a flash of hope. "What is your name?" "Amir, my lady." "Amir, I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell the Sultan that the witnesses are lying, that this accusation is a conspiracy by the advisors who want everything to go back to the way it was." The boy paled. "I can't, my lady. If they discover I spoke with you, they will execute me, and my mother has no one else." Sahara nodded, understanding. "Then just listen to this. The truth always comes to light, Amir, sooner or later. And when it does, remember that there were those who were on the right side of history." The guard quickly withdrew, but Sahara had planted a seed. If he had doubts, others would too. The Sultan spent his days in silent torment. He tried to concentrate on matters of state, on military reports, on administrative decisions, but his mind always returned to Sahara. He remembered their conversations, the way she challenged him, how she made him think about things he had never considered before. Had all that been magical manipulation, or had it simply been an intelligent woman speaking truths no one else dared to utter? On the third night before the trial, Kale could not bear it any longer. He dressed in dark robes and went down to the dungeons without an escort, only with a torch in his hand. The guards were surprised to see him, but none dared to question him. He walked down the damp corridor until he reached the cell at the back. Sahara was sitting on the floor, writing on the wall with the nail. When she heard the steps, she looked up. Her green eyes shone in the darkness as she recognized him. "You came," she said simply. "I had to see you," he replied, gripping the iron bars. "I had to know if everything we shared was real, or if it was a deception." Sahara stood and walked towards him. Even covered in dirt, with disheveled hair and a torn tunic, there was a dignity in her that amazed him. "Look into my eyes," she said. "Look at me, and tell me if you see a witch or a woman who only wanted to help you be better than you were." Kale looked at her. He studied every line of her face, looked for signs of deceit, of manipulation, of dark magic, and found none of that. He only found weariness, pain, and beneath all that a spark of hope that refused to go out. "If you are a witch," he said in a hoarse voice, "then your most powerful spell was making me see the truth about myself." "There is no spell," replied Zahara. "There are only words, and words have no power unless you are willing to listen to them. You chose to listen. You chose to change. That was not magic. It was bravery." The Sultan reached his hand between the bars. Zahara took it, and for the first time their fingers intertwined. That simple contact contained more intimacy than any night of forced passion. "I will get you out of here," he promised. "I don't know how, but I will." "Do not compromise your kingdom for me," said Zahara. "If you defend me against the law, you will lose the respect you have worked so hard to gain." "Then I will change the law," Kale replied with determination. "Or I will use it to destroy those who are using it against you." He returned to his quarters with his mind working feverishly. For the rest of the night he did not sleep. Instead, he began to investigate. He secretly summoned guards he trusted, those he had known in battle, whose loyalty was not bought. He ordered them to discreetly interrogate the witnesses who had accused Zahara, to look for inconsistencies, to follow the money trail. What they discovered over the next 2 days was revealing. One of the maids who had testified against Zahara had received a bag of gold from Malik, the fat advisor. A guard confessed after being pressured that Rashid had promised him a promotion if he declared he had heard strange chants. The spice merchant turned out to have enormous debts that had mysteriously been forgiven just after he gave his testimony. The Sultan gathered all this information, every confession, every piece of evidence of bribery. And when the day of the trial arrived, he entered the hall with a contained fury that made everyone present tremble. The trial would be held in the great throne room. The nobles of the court were seated on bleachers on both sides, murmuring among themselves. Rashid and the other advisers occupied their usual places, with barely concealed expressions of satisfaction. They brought Zahara in chains, and a murmur ran through the crowd upon seeing her. She was pale, thinner, but she walked with her back straight. The Sultan sat on his throne with a face of stone. Rashid stood to formally present the charges. "My lord, nobles of the court, today we gather to judge a terrible crime. The accused, Zahara of the House Sair, has been indicated by multiple witnesses for practicing witchcraft and using dark arts to manipulate the will of our beloved Sultan. The testimonies are clear and compelling. One by one, the witnesses were called to testify. They repeated their rehearsed stories about nocturnal rituals, strange chants, suspicious behavior. Zahara listened in silence, showing no emotion. When they finished, Rashid turned to the Sultan. "The evidence is overwhelming, my lord. The law is clear in these cases. The sentence for witchcraft is death." The hall filled with murmurs. Some nodded, others looked uncomfortable. The Sultan stood up slowly, and silence fell like a mantle. "Before passing sentence," he said in a voice that resonated off the stone walls, "I have some questions for the witnesses." Rashid blinked, surprised. "My lord, it is not necessary. The testimonies have been—" "Are you telling me what is necessary?" interrupted Kale in a dangerously soft voice. "Are you telling me how to govern my own court?" Rashid retreated, bowing his head. "Of course not, my lord. Proceed as you see fit." The Sultan descended from his throne and walked towards the first witness, a maid who had declared seeing strange rituals. "You say you saw my wife performing rituals in her quarters. Describe exactly what you saw." The woman hesitated. "Black candles, my lord, and she was speaking in a tongue I did not recognize." "At what time did this happen?" "Around midnight, my lord." "Interesting," said the Sultan, "because my personal guards have orders to record all movements in the royal wing hallways, and according to their reports, you were never near my wife's quarters at that hour. In fact, you were in the kitchens fulfilling your duties." The woman paled. The Sultan turned to the guard who had declared hearing chants. "You said you heard strange voices. Which night exactly?" The guard swallowed. "The night of the 15th of last month, my lord." "Curious," said Kale. "Because that night my wife dined with me in the private hall until past midnight. There were 10 people present who can confirm it." One by one, the Sultan dismantled each testimony, revealing the contradictions, the impossibilities, the lies. Then he turned to the crowd and raised his voice. But what is most revealing is not just the lies, but who paid for them. He made a gesture, and his trusted guards entered the hall, dragging a bound man. It was one of Malik's servants. "This man has something to say," announced the Sultan. The servant, trembling, confessed everything: the bribes, the threats, how Rashid and the other advisors had orchestrated the entire conspiracy. With each word, Rashid's face grew paler. When he finished, the Sultan turned to his advisors with eyes burning like coals. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Rashid tried to maintain his composure. "My lord, this is a misunderstanding. We acted thinking of the good of the kingdom. We genuinely believed—" "Silence!" roared the Sultan with a fury that made the walls tremble. "You did not try to protect the kingdom. You tried to protect your corrupt power, your ill-gotten riches, your privileged position built on the suffering of the people." He approached Rashid until he was face to face. "You said my wife had bewitched me, that she had weakened me. But the truth is that she opened my eyes to your corruption, and that is what you truly fear, not witchcraft, but justice." He made a gesture, and the guards surrounded the conspiring advisors. "For the crimes of conspiracy, false testimony, and attempted murder against the Sultan's wife, I strip you of your titles, your properties, and your positions. You will be banished from the kingdom, and if any of you sets foot in Almaguer again, you will be executed without trial." Rashid wanted to protest, but the guards were already dragging him out of the hall along with the other conspirators. Their cries of indignation were lost in the distance. The Sultan turned to Sahara, who remained standing in the center of the hall, the chains still on her wrists. He walked towards her, and with his own hands broke the shackles. The sound of breaking metal resonated like thunder. "Before the entire court, I declare that my wife Sahara is innocent of all accusations," he said in a firm voice. "More than that, I declare that she is the wisest person I have ever known. She has taught me that true power does not come from instilling fear, but from earning respect. That a king who does not listen to his people is not a king. He is a tyrant." He knelt before her, and a stifled cry ran through the hall. No sultan in the history of Almaguer had ever knelt before anyone. "Sahara of the House Sair, I ask your forgiveness for having doubted you. I ask your forgiveness for not having defended you from the beginning. And I ask you to allow me to continue learning from you, not as my wife, but as my equal." Sahara, with tears streaming down her cheeks, extended her hand and helped him to his feet. "You do not need to kneel before anyone," she said softly, "not even before me. A good leader stands on his own feet with his head held high, but with an open heart." The Sultan looked at her with an intensity that went beyond gratitude or relief. In that moment, in front of the entire court, something that had been growing in silence finally bloomed. It was not burning passion nor blind desire. It was something deeper and more lasting. It was mutual respect. It was admiration. It was the beginning of a love built not on physical attraction, but on the understanding of the soul. "From this day forward," announced the Sultan, turning to the court, "Sahara will be my official advisor. Her words will carry the same weight as mine in matters of justice and the welfare of the people. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." And so the young woman who had been delivered as an object, who had been falsely accused and locked in a dark cell, became the second most powerful person in the kingdom. Not by marriage, but by merit. Not by beauty, but by wisdom. Not by manipulation, but by truth. That night, when the storm had finally passed, Sahara and Kale sat together on the balcony of the royal quarters, watching the stars over Almaguer. They did not touch. It was not necessary. The closeness of their souls was enough. "I almost lost you," he said quietly. "But you didn't," she replied, "because you chose truth over tradition. You chose justice over convenience. You taught me to make those choices," Sahara smiled. "No, I only showed you the path. You were the one who had the courage to walk it." And in that moment of peace after the storm, both knew that something had changed irrevocably. The Sultan was no longer the lonely tyrant he had been, and Sahara was no longer simply his wife. They were companions, allies, two souls who had found each other in the midst of chaos and had decided to build something better together. The kingdom of Almagir was about to witness a transformation that no one had imagined possible. And it had all begun with a young woman who had dared to challenge the most dangerous lion in the kingdom, not with a sword, but with words of truth. The first rays of sun painted the sky golden when Sahara woke up in the room she now genuinely shared with Kale. Exactly 1 year had passed since that day she had been delivered as a silent offering. 365 days that had transformed not only her life, but the heart of an entire kingdom. She got up carefully so as not to wake the Sultan, who slept with a peace he had never known before. The nightmares that had tormented him for years had ceased. He no longer woke up brandishing invisible daggers or screaming names of dead enemies. Sahara walked to the balcony and looked out at the city stretching below the palace. Almagir had changed so much that sometimes she could hardly believe it was the same place. The streets were cleaner, all the public fountains worked, and crystalline water flowed freely for whoever needed it. The markets bustled with life, not with desperation. Children played in newly built squares with laughter that could be heard all the way to the palace. And in the neighborhoods that were once synonymous with misery, now stood medical clinics, schools, and community centers where the people could gather and be heard. It had all begun with small steps. After the trial that almost cost her life, Sahara did not waste the second chance she had been given. As the Sultan's official advisor, she had worked tirelessly to implement the reforms she had dreamed of. The first had been to establish a citizen council, where representatives chosen by the people could directly present their needs and proposals. At first, Kay had resisted the idea. "If you give them a voice, they will want more power," he had argued one night as they reviewed documents in the study. "Eventually, they will question every decision I make." "Let them question," Sahara had replied. "The best decisions are born from debate, not forced silence." A leader secure in himself does not fear questions, he invites them. And so it had been done. The first citizen council met with 12 representatives, merchants, farmers, artisans, a teacher, a doctor, common people who knew the real problems of the kingdom because they lived them every day. The meetings were held every 15 days, and although they were tense and full of distrust at first, they gradually became spaces for genuine dialogue. Sahara had also insisted on reforming the tax system. Tributes had been reduced for small merchants and peasants, while large landowners and nobles now paid their fair share. The collected funds were invested directly in projects that benefited the people: roads, bridges, irrigation systems, schools. For the first time in decades, the kingdom's money flowed downward, not just upward, but the most profound change had been in the justice system. Sahara had pressed for the establishment of public courts, where any citizen could present complaints against corruption, even against the Sultan's officials. Judges were chosen by merit, not by family connections, and sentences had to be explained publicly with clear reasoning. Justice was no longer a mystery reserved for the powerful. It was a right accessible to all. The new advisors who had replaced Rashid and his corrupt group were men and women chosen for their integrity and experience. Among them was a brilliant woman named Layla, a former merchant who had lost her business to abusive taxes. She was now in charge of the royal treasury and managed finances with crystalline transparency. Another was Tariq, a former soldier who had seen too much unnecessary war and now worked to establish peace treaties with neighboring kingdoms instead of conquering them. The people had begun to call Sahara by a title she never sought, but carried with quiet pride: the woman who tamed the lion. Stories were told about her in the markets, in the taverns, around nighttime campfires. Stories about how she had arrived at the palace as a silent wife and transformed a tyrant into a wise leader. Mothers told their daughters to be brave like Sahara. Fathers taught their sons that true strength was not in muscles, but in character. Kale woke up and found her on the balcony, lost in her thoughts. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her. It was not a gesture of possession, but of companionship. Over the past year, their relationship had evolved from a forced imposition to a genuine partnership and finally, to a deep love that neither had anticipated. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice still hoarse from sleep. "How far we have come," she replied, leaning against his chest. And how much further there is to go. You always think about what's left, he said with a smile in his voice. You never stop to celebrate what we have already achieved. When all the women in this kingdom can choose their own destiny, then I will celebrate. Kale fell silent. He knew what she was referring to. Despite all the changes, a law still existed that allowed forced marriages, an ancient law rooted in traditions dating back centuries. Sahara had mentioned the topic several times, but Kay had always found excuses to postpone it. It was too radical a reform, he said. The nobles would oppose it. Traditional families would see it as an attack on their customs. But that morning, looking at the city they had transformed together, something became clear in the Sultan's mind. If he had truly changed, if he genuinely believed in everything Sahara had taught him, then he couldn't stop halfway, not when the injustice that shamed him the most was the one that had begun his own love story. Today is our anniversary, he said, after a long silence. A year since you were brought here against your will. I know, Sahara replied softly. I want to do something special, something that will mark this day forever. Over the following weeks, the Sultan worked in secret on a project he kept hidden even from Sahara. He consulted with jurists, theologians, historians. He studied the laws of other kingdoms where women had more freedoms. He wrote and rewrote the language of a decree that he knew would change Almagir forever. And when it was finally ready, he summoned the entire court for a special audience. The day arrived with a clear blue sky and an air charged with anticipation. No one knew why the meeting had been convened, but rumors circulated like leaves in the wind. Some said the Sultan would announce a new military campaign. Others speculated there would be important appointments. A few, the more dreamy ones, whispered that something extraordinary was about to happen. The great throne room was packed to bursting. Nobles and commoners shared the same space for the first time in the palace's history. The bleachers, normally reserved only for the aristocracy, now had representatives from all the city's neighborhoods. Sahara sat on a smaller throne next to the Sultan's, dressed in emerald green silk robes that made her eyes shine. When the Sultan stood, silence fell like a heavy curtain. He walked to the center of the raised platform where everyone could see him clearly. He was not wearing his war crown, nor his most elaborate ceremonial robes. He had chosen to dress in simple white robes, a symbol of a new beginning. Exactly 1 year ago, he began in a voice that resonated in every corner of the hall, this woman sitting beside me was delivered to me as a wife. She was not asked her opinion. Her wishes were not considered. She was treated as property transferred from one owner to another. And I, in my arrogance and blindness, accepted that arrangement without questioning the fundamental injustice it represented. A murmur ran through the crowd. Sahara looked at him surprised, not knowing where this speech was heading. But that night, Kale continued, something extraordinary happened. Instead of accepting the role assigned to her, Sahara did something no person in this kingdom had dared to do in my entire life. She challenged me, looked me in the eyes, and told me she had not come to my bed, but to my destiny. He paused, letting his words settle. At first I thought it was arrogance, then I thought it was madness, but eventually I understood it was something much more dangerous for a tyrant. It was the truth, and that truth began to crumble the walls I had built around my heart. He walked to Sahara and extended his hand to her. She took it, confused but trusting, and stood up next to him. During this year, Sahara has taught me that true power does not come from conquering territories, but from conquering hearts. That a strong kingdom is not built on fear but on respect. That justice is not a luxury for the rich, but a right for all. And the most important lesson of all, that no human being should be treated as another's property, regardless of their gender, social position, or the traditions we try to use as an excuse. He turned to the crowd, still holding Sahara's hand. Today, before all of you, I declare something I should have said a year ago. Sahara, you are not my wife because you were delivered to me. You are my wife because I choose to give you my heart, my respect, and my devotion, and only because you freely choose to accept them. Sahara felt tears begin to roll down her cheeks. She had never expected this. She had never dreamed that the man who once looked at her with indifference could speak of her with such reverence. "But words without actions are empty," the Sultan continued. "That is why today I enact a new decree that will forever bear the name of the woman who saved this kingdom from its own ruler." He made a signal, and a scribe approached with a rolled parchment sealed with royal wax. The Sultan took it and held it up for all to see. "This is the decree of Sahara, also known as the law of free choice. From this moment on, all forced marriages in the kingdom of Almaguir are abolished. No woman, regardless of her age or social position, can be forced to marry against her will. No family may use their daughters as bargaining chips in political or commercial negotiations. Every marital union must be freely consented to by both parties, or it will be considered null before the law." The murmur became a roar of mixed voices. Some nobles protested, others applauded. The women in the audience, both noble and common, wept openly. Mothers hugged their daughters, knowing they would have freedoms that were denied to them. "I know this law will face resistance," said the Sultan, raising his voice over the noise. "I know there are those who will say I am destroying sacred traditions, but I ask you, what is sacred about forcing someone into a life they did not choose? What is traditional about unnecessary suffering? If our customs are built on the pain of others, then they are not customs worth preserving." He unrolled the parchment and read the main clauses. Establishment of severe punishments for those who forced marriages, creation of shelters where women fleeing forced unions could find protection, educational programs to teach families about the value of consent and personal autonomy. Everything was there, detailed with the legal precision that only weeks of careful work could produce. When he finished reading, he turned to Sahara with an expression that contained all the vulnerability he had once feared to show. "A year ago, this woman was delivered to me as a wife. Today, I deliver myself to her as a man, not by law, not by decree, but by choice, and I hope to spend the rest of my days being worthy of that choice." The hall erupted in applause, not the courteous, measured applause of the court, but something wild and genuine. The people stood up, nobles and commoners alike. Some shouted praises, others simply wept. Women hugged each other, sharing a moment of hope that many had never felt before. Sahara could not speak. The words had stuck in her throat, choked by the emotion threatening to overflow. Everything she had fought for, everything she had risked her life for, was coming true before her eyes, not by her own hand, but because she had planted seeds in a heart everyone believed was sterile. And those seeds had blossomed into something beautiful. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days. For the first time in Almaguir's history, the palace opened its doors to the people. There was music in the streets, food shared among strangers who became friends, and a palpable feeling that something fundamental had changed in the very fabric of the kingdom. The years that followed witnessed transformations that seemed impossible. With forced marriages abolished, young women began to choose their own paths. Some married for love. Others chose to remain single and dedicate themselves to studies or trades. More schools opened, not just for boys but also for girls. Women began to occupy positions once reserved only for men, doctors, merchants, even judges. The kingdom prospered in ways that went beyond material wealth. Alliances with neighboring kingdoms strengthened, based now on fair trade and mutual respect instead of military threats. Wars ceased. Soldiers returned to their homes and became builders, teachers, farmers. Almaguir became a beacon of hope for other kingdoms, where justice was still a distant dream. Khail and Sahara ruled together for 35 more years. They had 3 sons and 2 daughters, each raised with the freedom to choose their own destiny. Their grandchildren ran through the same hallways where once only silence and fear had reigned. And when Khail finally closed his eyes for the last time at the age of 67, he did so with a smile on his lips and Sahara's hand in his. The Sultan had asked before dying that his tomb be simple. He did not want statues of war nor monuments to his conquests. He wanted to be remembered not for the lands he had taken, but for the lives he had improved. The people, however, had their own ideas. They chose a monument in the central square of the capital. It was not a statue of the Sultan with his sword held high, as would have been traditional. Instead, they carved a scene in white marble, Sahara standing before Kale with a parchment in her hand. And below, engraved in golden letters that shone under the sun, were the words that had changed an entire kingdom. "I did not come to your bed, I came to your destiny." Sahara lived 15 years longer than her husband. She continued to serve as an advisor to her eldest son, who had inherited the throne and ruled with the same wisdom his parents had taught him. But her most precious days were those when she walked through the city, observing the fruits of the seeds she had planted decades before. She saw girls walking to school with books under their arms and dreams in their eyes. She saw young women negotiating in the markets as equals, running their own businesses, making their own decisions. She saw couples marrying for love, not obligation, with genuine smiles instead of resignation on their faces. And every time she saw these things, her heart filled with a satisfaction so deep it hurt. One afternoon, when Sahara was 74 years old, she climbed with difficulty to the balcony where she had so often contemplated the kingdom with Kale. Her hair was completely white now, her back slightly bent with age. But her green eyes still shone with the same intelligence and determination of that 19-year-old girl who had dared to challenge a tyrant. She looked towards the horizon where the sun was setting, painting the sky in golden and purple hues. The city stretched before her like a living tapestry full of color and movement. From her elevated position, she could see the new constructions, libraries, hospitals, community centers. She could hear the sound of children laughing, of merchants negotiating, of life flourishing where before there had only been survival. "We did it, my love," she whispered to the wind, as if Kale could hear her from wherever he was. "We changed the world, not with swords or conquests, but with words and justice." One of her granddaughters, a bright 12-year-old girl named Amara, came up to the balcony and stood next to her. "Grandmother, at school today we learned about you, about how you came to the palace and changed everything. My teacher says you are a heroine." Sahara smiled and ran her hand through the girl's hair. "I wasn't a heroine, little one. I was just a person who refused to accept injustice as normal, and I was lucky enough to find someone willing to listen." "Were you scared?" asked Amara. "When you challenged the Sultan, were you scared of dying?" "I was terrified," Sahara admitted. "But I learned something important. Fear is not bad. Fear is only a sign that something important is at stake. What matters is what you do despite the fear." "When I grow up," said Amara with determination in her voice, "I want to be like you. I want to change the world." Sahara knelt with difficulty until she was at her granddaughter's height and took her face between her wrinkled hands. "You don't have to wait until you're grown up, my love. Every act of kindness, every moment you choose truth over a lie, every time you defend someone who cannot defend themselves, you are changing the world. Change isn't always big and loud. Sometimes it's small and quiet. But those small changes add up until they become something extraordinary. That night, Sahara fell asleep in her bed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. And when the sun rose the next morning, her heart finally rested. She had lived 74 full years. She had loved deeply, fought bravely, and seen with her own eyes how an entire kingdom transformed from a place of fear to one of hope. Her funeral was not a sad event, but a celebration of life. Thousands of people filled the streets to bid her farewell, not because they were forced to, but because they genuinely wanted to honor the woman who had given them freedom. Women of all ages walked in procession, each carrying a white flower, the same color as the robes Sahara had worn that first night in the palace. And when her body was placed next to Kale's in the royal mausoleum, they engraved on her tomb the words she herself had written on the wall of that dark cell during her trial: "Truth is stronger than 1,000 chains, and justice lasts longer than 1,000 kingdoms." The years passed, decades turned into centuries, but the story of Sahara was never forgotten. It became a legend, then a myth, and finally something more powerful than both. A living example of what one person can achieve when they refuse to accept that things have to be a certain way just because they always have been. Mothers still told the story to their daughters. Teachers taught it in schools alongside mathematics and sciences. Leaders studied it when they needed to remember that true power comes from serving, not from dominating. And whenever someone in Almaguer faced an injustice, they remembered the words that had started it all. I did not come to your bed, I came to your destiny. Because Sahara had not simply come to change her own destiny, she had come to change the destiny of a man, of a kingdom, and of countless generations that would come after. The young woman who had been delivered as an object had become the queen who freed an entire kingdom, and her legacy would live forever, not in golden statues nor marble palaces, but in the heart of every person who chose truth over convenience, justice over tradition, and love over fear. That was the true power of her story, not that a woman had tamed a lion, but that she had awakened the humanity in him. And in doing so, she had proven that no person is beyond redemption. No heart is too hardened to be touched by truth, and no kingdom is so lost that it cannot find its way back to the light. Almaguer had been reborn, and it had all begun with a brave young woman, a parchment, and 7 words that changed the world. I did not come to your bed, I came to your destiny. And that's the end. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, share, and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love knowing how far our stories can reach.